From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
Pope Francis has issued new laws for battling clergy sexual abuse. Catholics everywhere are asking questions. Will they be effective? Will bishops be held accountable? And will lay people have a voice? This week on Register Radio, we talked to Register correspondent Lauretta Brown and the Catholic News Agency's editor-in-chief, JD Flynn, about Pope Francis's motu proprio, "You Are the Light of the World." I'm Matthew Bunson, co-host of Register Radio, and Register senior editor Jeanette DeMello, editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register and co-host, is off this week. Well, Vos estis lux mundi. You are the light of the world. That's the name of the new motu proprio, or papal decree, issued by Pope Francis last week, establishing universal norms for dealing with the sex abuse crisis. It's part of the Pope's promise of concrete steps to deal with the crisis, but many are asking if it goes far enough and if it will be at all effective in holding bishops accountable. To talk about the new norms and what they might mean for the future, we're joined by JD Flynn, editor-in-chief of the Catholic News Agency, and Lauretta Brown, the Register's D.C. correspondent. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
It's nice to have two people I know who have been reporting on this. And JD, let me start with you, because as a canonist, what struck you the most immediately about the new norms?
Well, it struck me that the new norms of Pope Francis are a foundation from which to build a comprehensive policy. So what the Pope has done here is create some criteria by which bishops, he says, should be judged when they are either accused themselves of sexual abuse or misconduct, or when they're accused of negligence or cover-up in office. And then he set sort of the framework for an investigatory process. But there are a lot of unfinished details that the Pope sort of defers to either Episcopal conferences, a bishop's conference, or to metropolitan archbishops to decide themselves. So we have the foundation for a really robust policy with room for the Bishops' Conference here in the United States, the USCCB, or other bishops' conferences to really kind of bring it to completion.
Yeah, I want to get to the upcoming bishops' meeting in June, because I think that has assumed even more importance with the promulgation of this motu proprio. But it's almost impossible to think about this motu proprio without also going back first to November with the last bishops' meeting, in which very famously, almost controversially, they were instructed that they could not vote on a series of proposals. But I'm also thinking of the Vatican summit in February, where Pope Francis made the promise for some of these concrete steps. So are we seeing a progression here? And do you see signs of continuity, both with what the bishops were considering last November, but also what was being talked about in February? JD?
I do, because the threads of the conversation in November were that the bishops in the United States recognized that they needed a way for lay people, priests, and religious to raise complaints against bishops, concerns about bishops that would be heard, that would not lead to negative consequences for them, so they needed sort of whistleblower protection. And then they needed to know that there was a process of clarity for investigating allegations of abuse or misconduct against bishops. And two sort of ideas were floated. One was an idea that would be a kind of national lay expert review board that would handle all allegations against bishops. And the other idea that was floated was the idea that metropolitan archbishops, so the archbishop of a particular archdiocese and the diocese regionally surrounding it, would be responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct or abuse on the part of bishops in their area. And that thread, which began in conversation at the Bishops' Conference meeting in November, was taken up again at the Sex Abuse Summit at the Vatican, because there was a great deal of discussion about ensuring that a process for investigating allegations of misconduct would fit into our theological understanding of the role of the bishop. And that has then been brought, I think, to fruition here in Vos Estis.
So, Lauretta, for somebody who is just sitting down to try to digest this motu proprio, it's titled, "You Are the Light of the World. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." This is from Matthew 5:14. Why do you think Pope Francis chose this title for the motu proprio?
I think it's possible he had transparency concerns in mind in light of, the scandals that we've all seen globally now. But yeah, that occurred to me when I saw the title, and also just holding yourself to a high standard, I think, is something else that occurs to me.
And this is for both of you. Is there also an element here, perhaps, a tacit recognition that we are being impeded very badly in evangelization, in being that shining example of virtue, to use that very first line from the motu proprio, because of just the sheer damage to our credibility because of the sexual abuse crisis? JD?
I think so. There is a sense that the church is a city set on a hill, the New Jerusalem, and so both her good deeds and her misdeeds are seen with startling clarity sometimes. And I think the Pope has recognized and spoken about the fact that the credibility of the witness of the gospel itself is undermined by the failure of the church's leaders, especially. I think the credibility of the gospel in some ways is undermined to those who might hear it by the moral failings of any Christian, although all of us are sinners. But I think the Pope has said especially that if the church's institutional leaders are not living with the kind of integrity to which Christ calls us, then it's understandable why people would doubt the veracity of the gospel. It's interesting to me the use of "You are the light of the world" from Matthew 5:14, because it comes right after the imagery that Christ uses of our being the salt of the earth, and that image, the salt of the earth kind of metaphor, is often used, especially now with regard to the role of lay people in the life of the world, to imbue the secular world with the Spirit of Christ. And so, I can't help but wonder in a certain way if the Pope is also pointing to the importance of all of us as Catholics being involved in the process of ecclesial reform and renewal, and that's something he's spoken about a great deal as well.
In his introduction in the motu proprio, he writes that this responsibility, by which he's referring to the implementation of norms and really leading the church through this commitment to restore the credibility of the gospel message and the effectiveness of the church's mission, he said, falls upon the successors of the apostles chosen by God to be pastoral leaders of his people, and demands from them a commitment to follow closely the path of the divine master. I was struck immediately in reading this that this is targeted for bishops, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Because at the end of the day, the church is a hierarchical institution. The church is centered around, organized around, and led by the successors of the apostles, the bishops, and the successor of St. Peter himself, the Roman pontiff, the Bishop of Rome. And so what we have learned in recent months is that no matter how much there is a call for integrity, no matter how much there are even procedures and policies put in place for the church to act with integrity, so much of the church's governance and the church's life that flows from that governance is dependent upon the integrity to the gospel of our bishops. That if Pope Francis himself has said consistently that it doesn't matter what policies we implement, it doesn't matter what we try to put in place if we can't depend on the successors of the apostles to observe them with fidelity to the gospel and integrity to an understanding of the dignity of the human person and the importance of moral integrity. And so I think his reminder here...
Go ahead, please.
I think his reminder here points right to that the moral integrity of our bishops is at the heart of any kind of reform that we'll see in the church.
But to be successful, to be implemented fully, comprehensively, transparently, and you can throw in a lot of other terms here, he has to have the full cooperation of the bishops of the world, the Episcopal conferences, because he seems to have left them so much latitude in how they're going to apply this. Lauretta?
Yes, certainly. I think that was something that was brought up by many, is he puts power in the Metropolitan in this model, and it does leave space for the different local bishops to apply it to their situations. And I think there are things that people liked about that and concerns that were raised as well.
What were some of the reactions of the bishops that you've talked to? Because I know in your reporting you've discussed this with a number of them. Yeah,
so I spoke with Bishop Paparocchi and Archbishop Cordileone, and they welcomed the international response. They they thought it was smart for the Vatican to come in and meet on and address this in a document in this fashion that tries to kind of give a baseline in this way universally. And so their responses were largely positive, I would say. They think it made sense to have a meeting with bishops around the world, and they welcomed a lot of the language in the document, the way it sort of broadened certain categories, like addressed vulnerable persons, addressed things that relate to even specific incidents that we've seen. And I think Bishop Paprocki addressed the McCarrick scandal that we saw here in Washington, and he mentioned that his biggest concern in November was that McCarrick was a Metropolitan, and we kind of saw what happened with him, and he did think that this model would have potentially helped that situation, and he admired the safeguards about you'd go to the senior suffragan, and there would be a report to the Holy See, to the nuncio. And it was interesting, however, because Archbishop Cordileone, he said something similar, but he acknowledged also that there were some personalities, sensitivities involved there, and and I think this is kind of one fact that is in people's minds as we go into the June meeting, is that with the McCarrick situation, at least, there are a lot of allegations that a lot was known about it and procedures were followed and things weren't done. So one thing that a canonist I spoke with, Ben Nguyen, sorry, I paused on the last name. He told me that this model depends on the people carrying out in some ways.
Right. Well, and to that point, JD, the Metropolitan Model seems to be the best we can get, or is there something out there that might be more effective, in your opinion?
Well, the Metropolitan Model, as it were, the idea that metropolitans themselves are principally responsible for investigating allegations of abuse or misconduct is baked into Vos Estis. So it's not at this point a question of the best we can get or not, but a question of what can the U.S. bishops do, or should the bishops do, to tweak it to our circumstances. And one of the things that there's room for, and one of the things that I think the U.S. bishops have a responsibility to be very thoughtful about, is inclusion of expert consultors for the bishops. So it can be hard for a person who's not trained in psychology to understand the mentality of a victim and why a victim's story might be inconsistent or unclear or ambiguous or evolving. It can be hard for someone who's not an expert in law enforcement to understand how other parties might have had knowledge of things or implied knowledge of things but been able to act or felt unable to act. Expertise is required in understanding the scope of these kinds of problems and pinpointing precisely what the issue is and how it should be addressed. And so the U.S. bishops have an opportunity to invite expertise into this process through the use of lay review boards, in the same way that they've invited expertise into the process of investigating priestly allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse of children. That process, the process of involving expert review boards, has been extremely, extremely successful for the Church in the United States. Nobody can deny that. So it's a question of whether the U.S. bishops will try to replicate the success that they've had there in this new process for investigating bishops that Vos Estis has given us.
Yeah. Well, this is Register Radio. I'm Matthew Bunson, co-host of Register Radio. My great colleague, Jeanette DeMello, editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register, is off this week, and I'm continuing my conversation with Lauretta Brown, Register correspondent, and JD Flynn, editor-in-chief of the Catholic News Agency. Well, to continue along that line, though, JD, in your view, especially as a canonist, does the Metropolitan Model do sufficient justice to the important theological realities, the ecclesiological realities that have to pertain to any kind of oversight of bishops?
I think it's a complicated question. I think yes. I think bishops, a bishop is in communion to be in communion with the Church, a bishop has to be in communion with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And the idea, the structure that we have in the life of the church of metropolitans, archbishops, who have a sort of largely ceremonial role in a particular region that we call a metropolitan region, that structure itself is not sort of given to us by divine institution. Our Lord established the episcopate, to be sure, when he made his apostles bishops, but he didn't establish some of them as metropolitan archbishops. I think we can be pretty certain of that.
Right.
Still, we have a structure. The church is a structure, and she has a way of doing things, and that structure is built and predicated upon our theological understanding of the communion between bishops, the collegiality, the genuine theological collegiality of bishops, and then their necessary communion with the Bishop of Rome. And so this model, I think, does make efforts to be deferential to that. A bishop exercises the power of governance in the church by virtue of his ordination, and that power of governance, that munus regendi, is something that I think is unquestionably sort of a part of the issues of clergy discipline, and especially the discipline of other bishops. And I think this model attempts to account for that and account for the very practical ways that the church has built up of understanding herself and operating over hundreds of years, and at the same time leave room for things like the collaboration of expertise that the bishops themselves don't have. Is it transparent? That's another question.
Right. And it also brings us to one of the overarching questions I know, JD, you've written about, and Lauretta, I know you got some very strong opinions about what is the role of lay people, and is this sufficient for the role of lay people?
Yeah, so I think there's this sense that that I got that there's definitely a desire in the U.S. for the role of the laity to be bigger here in the interest of transparency. So I talked to Father John Levers, who had conducted an investigation of some homosexual activity at Holy Apostles Seminary. And he had submitted his report on that to the USCCB, and they had sent him a letter kind of thanking him, and we looked at his work there, but I talked to him about the motu proprio a little bit, and he talked about kind of the concern about this culture in the episcopacy where bishops are looking out for their brother bishops in kind of an inappropriate way, like they're covering things up. That sort of concern, that's just a real concern. And so he was definitely had been a much bigger fan of a lay commission and had made recommendations to that effect, and was disheartened that route wasn't taken. And he did acknowledge that there was kind of a glimmer of hope for building on the motu proprio to strengthen the role of the laity. That the USCCB, they did have a little bit of room to do that. And it's kind of just we'll see how that happens. And I talked to Susan Timney, who's the associate professor of pastoral studies at CUA, and she noted that it's kind of this interesting area for the USCCB to because the role of the lay people in the church. She said, it's not in the nature of the church for lay people to share in the governance of the office of the bishop, right, as we were saying. But the exercise of co-responsibility is an area that needs to be developed, and part of that is holding leaders accountable. So this is kind of an opportunity to look at that and expand that. And she says it's going to be interesting to see how that could be done. And I think there's definitely a sense with her. I also spoke with Francesco Cesario, who's the chairman of the Bishops' National Review Board, and he had a similar thought that there's this room for a strengthening of a proper role of the laity, and he was disappointed that the motu proprio didn't leave more room for that, but he also said there's some room for it. So,
and yet, JD, there seems to be quite a bit of latitude, and as we head into the bishops' meeting in June, what are you hearing, and what do you suspect at the end of the day this is going to look like in terms of lay involvement, at least for the United States?
Yeah, I don't think that the bishops themselves know. I mean, From what I understand in talking with sources in Rome and in the United States, the leadership of the USCCB did not have a whole lot of head start on this document relative to when we learned about it. I mean, just a little bit of time, really. And so I think we've
been hearing, haven't we, that even some of the other dicasteries hadn't seen much of this.
Right. That's exactly right. So this seems to have been produced with a relatively small group of people in Rome, and as you've been hearing and I've been hearing too. And so some offices of the Holy See, some dicasteries of the Holy See who might have weighed in, seem not to have played the kind of role that we might have expected, nor did the heads of bishops' conferences play a kind of concrete role in the development of this text. And so the consequence of all of that for the June meeting of the bishops, which is now just in a couple of weeks, I better buy my airplane ticket, is that they really have not developed, I think, a space in the agenda to come out with something concrete about the way that lay people could be, and experts even beyond lay people, but the way that experts could be involved in the process. I think there will probably be a very open discussion about that, and then the Canonical Affairs Committee of the conference or some other body will take from that conversation some of the more concrete things that are suggested and develop some proposals or models or a kind of vademecum, a kind of handbook to go along with Vos Estis. At the same time, the bishops will be voting on a kind of code of conduct that they have agreed on between themselves about the way that bishops should comport themselves with regard to these kinds of things, and a document that gives them some guidance on how to address retired bishops who themselves have been the subject of allegations of misconduct or negligence. But in terms of these really specific things that they can do, a sort of procedural handbook that would involve the use of lay review boards, I don't know that there will have been sufficient time from the perspective of the bishops to have something that they're able to vote on by the June meeting, which means that probably they're going to have to make sort of some strong statements that that's what they are looking towards, and then do the follow-up as time passes.
Right. So it's been a year, Lauretta, basically, since the stunning revelations relating to now Mr. Former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. And yet the shadow of McCarrick's continued to loom rather large over this Episcopal Conference and the U.S. Church.
Yes, it certainly does, and I think it was something that was brought up in many of the conversations I had regarding this document, because I think a question that's very much in the minds of people is, what would that situation have played out differently under these norms? And as I mentioned, some of the bishops I spoke with thought that it would have helped in certain ways, and others were less confident because, again, there's this sense of it's up to the people carrying it out, the success of a model like this one, anyhow. But I think it's something that it should be interesting to see. If those concerns could be more thoroughly addressed, if there's room for that, at least in the U.S.
Well, and JD, if we look globally, one of the questions that is asked is sort of can the motu proprio, but then can these very specific actions on the part of the U.S. bishops pass what you can call the McCarrick test? Would they have prevented Theodore McCarrick? Would they have brought him to justice? But this is a question that can be asked by Catholics all over the world. We just swap out the names. We can put in Caradima. We can put in Bishop Juan Barros. We can put in Bishop Zanqueta of Argentina and Bishop Pineda of Honduras. So is it a fair question for Catholics around the world to be asking, will this do the trick?
Yes, it's a fair question. The answer depends on two things. One, what the bishops' conferences in various parts of the world do with the document, whether they build something on it or not. And two, whether they find a way to insert a kind of transparency into that process. I don't think that bishops maliciously cover for each other very often, but I think that there is a kind of understandable institutional blindness that happens when people who all have a very common set of life experiences and perspectives are looking at a situation. It can be hard to consider things from other perspectives, which is what's essential to addressing matters like this. And so the degree to which the bishops learn to hear from other voices on these matters in a substantive and meaningful way, and then and then are in some way accountable for their decisions to the people of God, just by the people of God having knowledge of them is sufficient. I think those are the things that would allow Vos Estis to sort of take on the kind of role that would stop much earlier a figure like McCarrick in the life of the church.
Right. Well, in the very little time that we have left, it's just a sort of a one-word answer from each of you. Do you expect the U.S. bishops at the end of this June meeting to leave with very clear proposals and, as you say, a vademecum, a handbook? Are there going to be clear steps, and do you think that this is going to mollify very upset Catholics? So I'll start with you, Lauretta.
Can I go with maybe? Maybe. We'll see.
JD?
I've been going to bishops' meetings for a long time, and I decided a long time ago that I would come to expect only the unexpected. So we will see.
Well, I seem to recall all of us getting in about 5 minutes into the meeting last November, and it was pretty clear that nothing was going to happen there. Clearly, though, I think the Holy See and the bishops, the U.S. bishops in particular, are working together on this to make everything work. I think that that bodes well, at least, for the process. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they're on a good place, and the question will be over what time period will they address things and with what degree of urgency.
All right. Well, we're going to have to wrap things up here on Register Radio this weekend. JD, thanks so much. Very, very quickly, what are you working on?
Oh, we're working on a lot of stuff, and you can check it out at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Subscribe to our podcast, CNA Newsroom, wherever you get your podcasts, or follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and you can find out.
All right. And Lauretta, it's a joy working with you. I look forward to your next articles. You can find those at ncregister.com. For anyone who wants to get more information about the National Catholic Register or Register Radio, please go to that aforementioned ncregister.com. Be sure also to check out our podcasts, as well as go to EWTNnews.com for all of the news from EWTN News. On behalf of Jeanette DeMello, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, I'm Matthew Bunson. Until next week, please, God bless.
This Easter season, read for faith, read for truth, read for life by giving yourself the gift of EWTN's National Catholic Register. Easter inaugurates a joyous season of hope and renewal that brings us closer to God. Gain a deeper understanding of His love and providence in reading the Register. Make this Easter season even more meaningful. Try the Register for free today and get it delivered to your home, office, or parish. To get your 6 free issues, order online at ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code RADIO. That's ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code RADIO. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully.